What's up guys, my name is Ace, and the second weekend for the Black Ops 6 beta is going live today. By the time this video is up, it should be live. And this morning we got the patch notes for all of the specific changes they made from week 1 to week 2. So in today's video, we're going to be going through these patch notes, keeping in mind this video isn't going to have quite as much detail as I usually put into my patch notes videos, simply because this is a beta and I don't have like all of the stats collected to show proper before and after comparisons with everything. But with that out of the way, let's dive into this. There's a pretty good list of things, and honestly, a ton of these things were things that I had on my feedback video from last week, so I'm quite happy to see them. But let's start it off with weapon swap speeds. For the second weekend, they've reduced the weapon drop time, so the amount of time it takes to put your weapon away, by 50 milliseconds for all of the weapon classes aside from sniper rifles. With those, the drop time is reduced by 100 milliseconds, so that got even more of a buff than the other weapon classes. And that's just great news. I felt in the first weekend, even just to pull out your pistol, I felt took way too long, especially considering how fast everything else happens in this game. So this is a slight but welcome reduction. Also keep in mind the fast hands perk will be available in the second weekend, and that will allow you to swap even faster. Next up, we got a bunch of movement speed adjustments here, and I'm not going to read out literally every single adjustment, but the main thing to note here is pretty much across the board, we saw movement speed increases to help most of the weapon classes compete a little bit better in the movement speed department with SMGs. So SMGs didn't get a massive increase, they only saw an increase to their crouch speed, but everything else was seeing aim down sight movement speed adjustments, base movement speed adjustments, and aim down sight crouch movement speed adjustments. And the only nerfs I saw here were to the pistols. The crouch movement speed was reduced slightly, as well as the aim down sight movement speed. And then for sniper rifles and launchers, they slightly reduced the crouch movement speed. But for everything else, we're just seeing buffs here. And very notably, in the melee category, there were some pretty significant adjustments here, especially to our sprint speed and our tactical sprint speed. You're going to be able to get around the map even faster now with a knife, and that was a conscious decision they made, so you really see that benefit, and they want to encourage people to swap to their melee weapon in order to get from point A to point B quickly. Next up for weapon adjustments, and I'm sure what many of you guys are here for, the Jackal PDW was nerfed. That gun was just a little too versatile, I would say, in the first weekend. As an SMG, it was far too effective at longer ranges. Up close, it was actually beat out by the C9, and still is. But I think the real problem was mid to longer ranges. So let's have a look at the Jackal on week 1, and as you can see here, it was a 4 to 6 shot kill. Whereas in the second weekend here, post-patch, it's still got that 4-shot kill potential, and honestly the range is almost the same as it was pre-patch, so right up close, you shouldn't notice much of a difference at all with the Jackal. However, now you'll see it steps down to a 5-shot kill, then a 6-shot kill, and then a 7-shot kill beyond about 26 meters. So they really targeted this hard at longer ranges, and it's not going to be able to compete nearly as effectively against assault rifles, for instance, beyond that 26-meter range. Now on top of this, they did slightly increase the recoil on the Jackal PDW, and for that one, unfortunately, time will have to tell. Again, I don't have pre-patch versus post-patch data on that one. And then on top of that, the CHF barrel, they actually buffed it for the Jackal. The headshot multiplier went from 1.2 with this barrel up to 1.4, but that was really just done to compensate for the damage drops that they included with this. It's still going to take you all 3 bullets to the head up close with this barrel in order to reduce the number of shots to kill down to 3, just like it did pre-patch when using this barrel. So realistically, this buff to the barrel wasn't actually a buff, it was just a compensation for the nerfs. As for the other SMG, the C9 or MP5, with this they slightly increased the medium damage range from 25.4 up to 27.3. It's a very slight buff, you probably won't even notice the difference, but there was a tiny buff there. And then for the SWAT 556, as well as any future burst weapons that we see, they have disabled burst fire queuing, which is excellent. That's something I was asking for in my feedback video. I just found it was a little bit frustrating. If you pulled the trigger just shortly after the current burst started firing, it would queue up that next burst, and no matter what, that next burst was going to fire, even if you haven't touched the trigger in a while and you didn't intend to fire that additional burst. So I am glad they made this change. It's going to feel a little better to use the burst guns, in my opinion at least. Next, they mentioned for the rapid fire attachment, it now correctly displays the recoil penalty con, which is nice to see. I made a video about that last week, showing that there was actually a con on this, even though the stats didn't list any cons whatsoever for rapid fire, and that had some people concerned. And with that, we can now move into the spawn section, and I do want to talk about this one a little bit. The first thing they did here is they adjusted general spawn logic to enable additional valid spawns under certain scenarios. I think that sounds good on paper at least. And they adjusted spawn logic across several maps with the goal of reducing a high frequency of spawn flipping. Again, on paper, this is sounding really good. Those are a couple of my primary concerns with the spawns, is they're just flipping a little bit too much. There wasn't really any establishment of map control or like, this is my side of the map, that's your side of the map. You would often be spawning side by side with enemies, and things would often get spread out all over the place, of course, depending on the map and the mode. Some maps and modes were worse than others. But then they go on to explain this a little bit, and I do want to talk about some of what they're saying here. One thing they mention is their definition of a bad spawn, or at least one of their definitions, is anytime a player deals or receives damage within 3 seconds of spawning. And they want to cut that down as much as possible. And they mentioned their worst offender for this in the first weekend of the beta was domination on Skyline, which makes sense, it is a fairly small map. And it was only a 4.2% rate, which means 4.2 out of every 100 spawns saw someone give or receive damage within 3 seconds. And that honestly doesn't seem that horrible, especially given the size of that map. However, I'm glad they also said here they recognize that we each have our own definition of what a good spawn or a bad spawn is, and that's not always just about combat situations. And I'm happy to see that, because that whole spawning within 3 seconds and taking damage or dealing damage, yeah, I think that's a factor that should be considered, but that's just one tiny bit of what an overall spawn system should be aiming for. But they go on to list a few examples here, which are examples that I brought up in my video. They mention examples like, did I spawn out too far from the hard point? Or why am I spawning on the same side of the map as the enemy team? So they do recognize the overarching spawn system and the placement of spawns in a map are critical to the flow of the match, and it's their goal in Black Ops 6, as with every prior Black Ops game, to have predictable spawn system that results on head-on engagements with your opponents while providing ample time from respawn for decision making. This includes accounting for time before getting into an engagement before you're ready for it. And everything they're saying here on paper is reassuring. It does seem like they're aware of the issues and flow is an important thing for them, and they are going to be working to get that into a better place. They also say later they know they have some work to do and will continue to process their data, evaluate our feedback, and play the game with us in order to draw their own conclusions on how to continue making positive progress. So like I have said, I don't expect spawns to suddenly be fixed in the second weekend. All I'm really hoping for here are some good, noticeable steps forward when it comes to spawns, so they can continue to make tweaks and get them into a better place over time. So there we go, that's spawns. Now let's move on to score streaks. And with the RCXD, they improve the handling and general usability, which is nice. I saw a lot of complaints around that one. For the Watchdog Helo, they increase the base health, so it's going to be a little more difficult to shoot down. And for the Hellstorm, they increase the cluster bomb damage radius, and I'm happy to see that, especially with how expensive a Hellstorm is to earn. I think it should be quite a bit more powerful than it was in the first weekend. Next, let's talk about equipment a little bit, and with the Thermo grenade, they reduce the explosive ignition delay, so it's going to go off a little bit sooner after you throw it. For some movement adjustments here, outside of like the weapon movement adjustments that we talked about earlier, they have a slight increase to the time to enter prone or supine during a slide, so you're not going to be able to do that move quite as quickly. Then there was a slight increase to mantle speeds, so that's actually a buff to mantle speeds. Again, that was something in my feedback video, and I'm really glad to see that take place. On top of that, there was a slight decrease to time before movement is allowed after landing from a dive to prone, which I definitely want to get my hands on with this one. I was actually pretty happy with that delay, because I think there should be a notable trade-off to diving around a corner, for instance. And I think that was the nice notable trade-off, was the fact that you were really committing to that move. But of course, as I'm recording this video, I don't know how much they changed this, so maybe it's still in an okay state for that. But then on top of that, there was a slight increase to dive to prone landing friction. Now after that, for the second weekend, they increased the amount of weapon XP we earn, so we should be able to get through those weapon levels faster. They also made a couple fixes to the daily challenges, and they made sure the beta rewards earned in a match will now appear in the after action reports. And then there were a bunch of adjustments to audio. So with this, they increased player weapon firing audio volume. They just mentioned additional footstep audio adjustments. They don't really say exactly what changed there, but I'm curious to get my hands on and listen for those. They also reduced audio levels for impact sounds when taking damage. They resolved an issue where shotguns would play more than the intended number of hit impacts. They resolved an issue where explosive sounds would not play during normal gameplay, as well as an issue where some sounds were not playing during the best play. And then they re-enabled the previously disabled audio occlusion system on the PlayStation 5. Now, speaking of best play, we just mentioned there, they made some adjustments to the underlying best play logic, which will result in a more varied and interesting best play section. Honestly, I thought the best play was tuned pretty well in the first weekend, but I'm curious to see what they've done here. Maybe it's even better now. Then for UI, they just mentioned they improved stability throughout various menus. They fixed the instant ADS transition timing for mouse and keyboard players as well, so you should be able to swap back to that if that's your preference. Then in the general section here, they increased the duration of the lobby vote before matches to give players a better opportunity to participate in the vote when returning to the lobby after a completed match. And they reduced the amount of camera motion in the dynamic death cam, and I think that's great. That's another thing I provided in my feedback. In the first weekend, it was quite a jarring camera movement, and for some people, it was actually triggering some motion sickness, so I'm glad to see they made an adjustment there. And then finally, for stability, they just mentioned they improved stability on Skyline, in the training course, and general server-side stability. And there we go. That is going to wrap it up for the patch notes from week 1 to week 2 for the Black Ops 6 beta. And overall, at least on paper, I'm quite happy with the changes they're making here. Obviously, there's still a bunch of other things that I've mentioned in my feedback video in the past that I hope will get resolved before launch, but obviously I don't expect every little thing to be fixed literally between week 1 and week 2, and I'm pretty happy with this list of changes considering the short timeline. Now, of course, these are just my thoughts, and I'd love to hear what you guys think about these patch notes in those comments down below. If you enjoyed this one, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.